Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK Spring Playoffs round number 4 overview and analysis video. It's the final video here in the spring split for any major region that we cover on this channel. We have one series left to discuss. Technically, it's round 4. It's not the finals like it is for every other region because of the weird road to MSI format that the LCK is undergoing, but it is one last best of 5 to determine the final team to go to MSI and the end of the spring split. I'm super excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. Of course, if you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you think of this series? Did it go as you expected? Were there any over or under performances in comparison to maybe what you were anticipating out of these two teams? I'm certainly going to get into where I, had some things go right, where I certainly had some predictions go wrong for this one. If you've seen the series, you definitely know what I'm talking about, but there is a lot of fun stuff to discuss between these two teams here today, so I cannot wait. I hope you guys are excited, but let's go ahead and get into things. If you are new here, what we're going to do in today's video is we are going to go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dead of the game for each game that we cover, and then of course at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Nothing really to preview, nothing to talk about. We will kind of quickly go over the MSI teams at the end of this video because we know every single one of them by this point, but that will be saved for its own separate video as per usual later on in about a week or so before MSI starts, where we go over every player and every team and power rank them all very similarly to how we've done for every tournament on this channel. But of course, most of today will be spent talking about this final series, this round 4 series that we ended up getting. So without further ado, let's actually jump into the analysis, shall we? It's a really fun matchup. I think on paper, these are two teams that have a lot of really interesting storylines, like players that have played against each other quite a lot over the course of their careers, and that makes it fun. It's a matchup between the number 2 seeded Hanwha Life Esports and the number 3 seeded T1, which of course you can see up on your screen. These guys are coming from very different perspectives getting to this series. It's kind of really felt like a top 2 in the LCK throughout a majority of this year, with Gen G going on their undefeated run, of course making the reverse sweep happen against Hanwha Life Esports, but HLE was up 2-0 in that series. They've been the only team that's consistently been able to push Gen G really at any point throughout this split, and on top of that, they are your defending champions from Winter Split. I guess not so much anymore. Gen G, I think, have earned that crown at this point, even if they're not technical champions of the spring split, but HLE are kind of, the second best team right now in Korea, and I think they've gone out and proved that. Again, I really want to highlight the fact that they won the first 2 games against Gen G. They put Gen G's back up against the wall. Gen G had to win 3 in a row in order to even come back and survive in that series. They obviously were able to do so, and part of that is to the failure of Hanwha Life, but at the end of the day, if you take the undefeated best team in the world at the current moment in Gen G and, put them down 2-0 in a series, you're a good team. I don't care. It doesn't really matter, like, regardless of how that series ended. Of course, it is frustrating, but there is talent on this team, and they should be coming into a series like this with a ton of momentum, and not just from that series, but from being pretty clearly the second best team in the regular season. You can talk about teams like T1 dropping random series in the regular season, maybe not being quite as consistent as some of the top tier teams. HLE was right there with Gen G for a majority of the split. Now, it wasn't always there. There were a couple of weeks here and there that weren't all ideal, but, that's in comparison to Gen G. Like, in comparison to T1, I would argue that they were more consistent throughout the regular season, especially because it didn't really take them any time to get going. They really only struggled against the best team in the league, but HLE are definitely coming in here as favorites. I think a majority of people are looking at this as a top 2 in the LCK, and especially because that series against Gen G went to 5, I think a lot of people see, Zeka as a big game performer, even though he was pretty horrible in that series against Gen G. I'm not going to say he solo lost it or anything like that. I think that there were a couple of things wrong, but Zeka was easily the worst player on the Rift in that quote-unquote final series that happened a little bit ago, but you would expect him to be able to step up. I think he's a more talented player in his current state than Faker is in his current state. I think a lot of people would probably agree with that opinion. A lot of people who watch the LCK, and Zeka's considered to be a bit more clutch at the moment. Now, Faker can obviously always turn it on, but usually that's saved for international tournaments and not so much for the domestic playoffs, at least if we're going historical. Although, again, that being said, Zeka was somebody who really underperformed in the previous series. If he's kind of losing that clutch factor, that could be the turning point for a player like Faker to be able to pick up a win, which he has not really been able to do a ton into Zeka throughout the past couple of years. I think you're looking at Viper and Delight being the better bot lane by a pretty clear margin right now. Respect to Gumayusi and Keria, they are getting into form and they've been very good over the past couple of weeks, specifically Gumayusi, who I think is starting to feel a lot more comfortable, but Viper is 1A, 1B with Ruler right now in terms of LCK AD carries, and Delight's probably been the best support in the world. If you take the entirety of 2025, it's a hard bar to try to match. For HLE, you've got Peanut going into Owner, two opposite styles. Peanut's had success into Owner in the past, but it's not been particularly consistent. That's the one place I think you would be concerned about if you're HLE, which we'll get into when we talk about T1. And then Zeus into Doran. Like, a lot of people would say that HLE very much upgraded with this swap in the offseason, that Zeus is an upgrade. So obviously a lot of storylines going on there. But for T1, you want to talk about the reasons that they should be favorited in a series like this. I think that there actually are a couple of things to point out that maybe a lot of people aren't going to be quite as vocal about. First and foremost, Owner has been an absolute monster across 2025. He's been this team's best player, and it's not been particularly close. That is a really good thing to be able to see. Again, if Owner's going to be able to win with resources, that changes the dynamic of how T1 might want to approach a lot of these games. And you know, in Peanut's case, I think this has maybe been his worst split in like a while, like maybe a couple of years. It really has not impressed me all that much. I think there have been good moments and bad moments, but for the most part, this guy's been like a league average jungler surrounded by a bunch of good players. Like Zeka's popped off in a couple of games. Zeus was the MVP runner-up for a lot of people, only behind Chovy. You have Viper and Delight as one of, if not the best bot lane in the LCK. You're looking at someone like Peanut being, you know, overshadowed, I would say, in that regard. And I would say that that's been accurate. The games that they have lost this year, it's been Peanut, you know, getting taken advantage of. And I'm a big defender of Peanut. I always have been. You know, it feels pretty vindicating to have defended him for all of these years on this channel and have him won so many titles in that span. But he has not really been the strength of the team this year. So Owner being in good form, I think, is definitely a positive for T1. Then you can talk about, again, like Doran was excellent in that series against KT. Rolster ended up being a real crucial piece in why T1 ended up winning that series. Guma and Keria are playing better right now than they have at any other point in 2025. They've started to level up. And Faker, you know, as much as I talk about the domestic playoff performance as not being unbelievable, he's had some really great ones in the past. They've just been a little bit further back than a year or two ago. And those international performances are absolutely still there. He was really great against KT Rolster as well. And so you're looking at a team that definitely has a lot going for them. And even more than that, just this magical voodoo that kind of surrounds them. You think Riot's going to run an MSI without having T1 there? Their viewership numbers would decline immensely. Of course they're going to try to get T1 to this tournament. Obviously, I'm joking. I don't want to, you know, get people really mad at me in the comments section below. Sometimes my sarcasm doesn't come across as I would want it to on this channel, but I want to make it clear that that is a joke. But jokes aside, like T1 going to international tournaments, it's just what they do. Even if they never go as the #1 seed, they've been going the past couple of years. And HLE, for as much as we want to consider them clutch, they just threw away a clutch series against Gen G that would have guaranteed them their spot. So they need to prove that they can keep their mental about them. This isn't just HLE being dominant. My prediction in this series, I believe, was HLE 3-0. I felt like they should be able to take this really without a ton of problems. I think 3-1 is very, you know, reasonable and understandable. I think T1 is good enough to be able to take 1 or 2 games. I would be surprised if they took the series. That was my prediction in the last video because I just think HLE is in incredible form. I think they're more talented overall as a team right now, and I think T1 kind of has been playing against the grain, a little bit behind their own tempo. But again, HLE coming off of a loss and T1 coming off of a pretty big win over a white-hot KT team. You never know who's going to lock in when it matters the most. But the only way to find out is to go game by game, and that means starting with game #1. So let's go ahead and get into it. The winner of game #1 was T1. They are going to take game #1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and I think this is a huge start for them. Again, I know I reiterate this at the beginning of every single video, but I think it's important for those of you who may not watch all of my content that games 1 and 3, in my opinion, and I think pretty statistically proven, are the most important games in a series. Being able to generate an early lead, being able to, you know, only have to win 50% of the last 4 games no matter what, even at your absolute worst, is already a big positive. But even more so than that, setting yourself up for a game 3 where it's at worst 1-1 and you're not going to be sitting in an elimination game, at least against you in game #3, is huge. And T1 being able to start off this series with a win on red side is actually pretty massive because red side's not exactly been the most consistent across this year. For T1, I think they played out their comp pretty expertly, which we'll get into, but for HLE, I just really hated how they played this game. A couple of major mistakes. I mean, we'll get into it. Peanut was absolutely miserable in game number 1. Like, maybe the worst game I've seen him play in a very long time. It genuinely really was that bad, and I'm not going to say that was the only reason they ended up losing. Like, bot lane was losing, top lane was losing. It wasn't really going well anywhere on the map, but at the end of the day, when you have no jungle pressure, and when you're allowing that matchup that I said was the sole one that I thought was in favor of T1 in terms of current ability, if you're allowing that matchup to just get so far out of control that it's basically unplayable, there's no real way for you to be able to equalize in a game like that, and T1 took full advantage of it. So let's go ahead and talk about it. If you are new, again, we're going to start with the draft, kind of talk about generally what my thoughts were on both of the drafts, and then talk about how that affected the game as a whole. Generally, I think both of these drafts kind of have their pluses and minuses. I'm pretty anti-T1's draft. I think it just lacks a lot of cohesion, in my opinion. I think every piece itself is solid, and we saw that throughout the game, but I don't really like the way that they individually like mesh together. At least from my perspective, you're looking at a pseudo team fight like engage comp in the back half of the game. You've got Nico Pop Blossom, you've got Wukong being able to cyclone in, and that's like fantastic team fight engage. You have plenty of ways to set up for a hyper carry or something like that, and then you just don't really have one of those on your team. You're relying on Gwen, Sylas, Kalista as your trio to be able to deal enough damage. Now, they definitely can deal enough damage. I'm not trying to sit here and say that Gwen can't be a primary carry in the later part of games, but again, if you followed the channel, you'll know my thoughts on the fact that Gwen being your number one in terms of damage dealing, when you have things like Sylas and Kalista that are good in team fights but aren't necessarily something that can be enabled like super heavily in team fights, when Gwen is relied upon to be this like big factor in 5v5, sometimes I get a little bit scared because it's just a little bit difficult, more difficult I should say, for Gwen to be able to involve herself if she doesn't have gold. Luckily for T1, early game went really well and Wukong got super fed, and so those engages ended up being super free. Gumayushi also had a ton of gold in this game on the Kalista, which makes things a ton easier, but if we're talking about just their draft from a neutral state, you know, I think that the pieces are good. Maybe the cohesion of the draft isn't particularly what I would be looking for. But for HLE, like, you're indexing into the Vi Ahri pick comp. Like, that's exactly what you're looking at here. Your mid game is everything. If you're not able to walk out of the mid game with a gigantic lead, it doesn't really matter that the other team around you doesn't necessarily have this, like, unbelievable, unbeatable team fight. You have good engage, but no real follow-up. Like, you have Vi Ahri. You're not going to have any damage in the later part of the game. And you supplemented that with Miss Fortune and Jace, and so you're definitely going to fall off as this game continues to go along. You don't really have anybody who can win a team fight on your side either. I would argue that T1 have all of the team fight threats, and so it just ends up in this situation where HLE have to try and make plays, and that's when, you know, Vi really shutting down and having a bad game ends up completely blowing up their play style. I hope that ended up making a little bit of sense, but for T1, what ended up working for them is just Owner having so much tempo and so much pressure on the map. Obviously, Owner's player of the game, although I will say Faker was in a huge competition for this. Faker was incredible here in game number 1 on the Sylas. One of his better games in a while. Really impressed with the way that he ended up playing the back end of this game. I think sometimes Sylas can be a bit difficult to operate, especially when you yourself have a lot of like free engage on the team already. Things like Nico and Wukong. A lot of people who play Sylas want to play him for the hero plays. I think sometimes you can just deal damage on that champion and be like a pseudo assassin and make that work, and that's exactly what Faker did. Again, we'll get into that. A lot of the setups this game were absolutely tremendous, but Owner was the main carry, I would say, overall, and the main kind of tempo gainer of the game, even if Faker's plays were incredible. And that's a really good sign. Again, I talked about this in the preamble, in the pre-show, if you will, that Owner kind of needs to step up. He needs to be the primary option for this team because he's the one lane that I think actively has just been better throughout a lot of this year in comparison to Hanwha Life. He very much did so in game 1. And the Wukong getting super far ahead ends up alleviating a lot of the problems that I talked about, because all of a sudden now it's not just, you know, Gwen having to dive into the backline and hoping that she can blow up the Ahri and the Miss Fortune and the Jace before they can get all their damage off, or Sylas doing the same thing, or Kalista having to be your front-to-back threat. Like, all of that goes out the window when Wukong can just press Q and like do, you know, 50% of Ahri's health bar. You know what I mean? It just becomes a lot easier to really express the rest of the game in that front. Also, he can frontline. Like, if you want to go full tank, you can absolutely do that. And he's going to be very difficult to kill alongside Sylas healing and Gwen being able to, you know, go immune and all of that stuff. So Owner getting fed really kind of changed the big dichotomy. But again, Owner and Faker, definitely the main characters, I would say, overall of this first game, which is really nice to see because they are the focal point in terms of jungle proximity and just pressure in general for T1. Guma and Keria were excellent. Viper and Delight did not have a good game, and Viper just kind of looked lost on the MF. I like Miss Fortune as a pick. I will defend her a lot in terms of where the community sees her at, because I just don't agree with where the community sees her at, but this was not the game for Miss Fortune. I think you needed more firepower, pun entirely not intended, coming out of the bot lane. Viper was entirely useless, just didn't really get to play the game, and that's not good enough. Again, he was also pretty bad down the stretch against Genji. Him and Zeka really needed to step up. Delight was fine, couldn't really do anything on Rel, but his jungler and his bot laner were completely out of the game. Even his top laner was completely out of the game. Really hard to play an engaged tank when you can't fight at any given point, so Delight ends up being pretty useless there, and Guma and Keria are the ones to push forward. Again, Guma's been in much better form as of late. I think the last, like, 2 or so weeks of the regular season, and then so far, like, the one series that he's played in the playoffs, like, it's looked pretty good. I want to see more consistent play because that first, like, 7-week stretch from Guma was just not very good really at all. He was one of the more middling AD carries near the top of the standings. Not to say he was, like, bad or anything, just that he wasn't really doing anything. He was playing weak side and just being ignored by his entire team, so it's nice to see him get some more runway, if you will. Carry has been fine as well. I think he's probably been better than Guma, but not by a ridiculous amount. He's not been, like, a top support in the LCK in terms of production or anything like that this year, but the Nico was really good here. Doran also really solid on the Gwen. Don't want to overlook him. He dominated the top lane matchup, but just a win for T1, winning everywhere around the map, mostly through the jungle mid duo, though. And then I've already talked a bit about HLE, but Peanut's going to get dead of the game here for game number 1. Really not a lot to go over in terms of why Peanut's getting dead of the game. This is one of the worst Vi games I've ever seen him play, and one of the worst games he's ever played. I think you just need to figure something else out because this was not it. I get playing around the mid game and trying to take advantage of the fact that Zeka's a really good skirmisher, but man, you probably need something a bit more consistent, especially coming off of 3 straight losses to Genji. That probably wasn't helping the morale. Viper and Delight got blasted in the bot lane. Again, Viper just played really poor in this game, even if Misfortune was never going to be particularly relevant with how this game ended up shaping out. Like, Viper didn't even try. Like, his positioning was just quite bad. Zeka was the only one with any sort of tempo, and even then it was artificial tempo because he was just trading 1 for 1. In a lot of these situations where the gold going to T1 was more valuable than the gold going over to the Ahri, and so it just ended up not really working out. And I think most specifically for me, I really want to see Zayu step up here. If he can come out and be better than Doran, you know, get this gigantic lead in the early game and actually do something with it as we transition into the mid to late game, I think that's going to be a key as well for Hanwha Life. So at least in game number 1, just some bad performances. Peanut getting blasted, Viper getting blasted. Like, that's okay. You just got to rectify it for game number 2. If you can't turn things around, that is a gigantic problem for Hanwha Life. And if T1 is going to be able to take game 2, all of a sudden they're up 2-0. Now HLE are in the position that they put Genji in just 1 series ago, where they have to win 3 in a row to even have a chance to come back. Are they going to be able to avoid disaster and tie up the series at 1 apiece, or is T1 going to take full control of this series by winning a 2nd in a row? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and somehow, some way, we are staring down the barrel of a 2-0 T1 series lead here. HLE is 1 game away from not even going to MSI, which would be a huge upset for a team that not only is defending their LCK trophy, which obviously they've already lost, I guess, but they're defending their international trophy. They won the first big international event of the year in First Stand. For them not to be at the MSI tournament, at the midseason Invitational, would be absolutely insane, but now we are getting closer and closer to that reality, and T1 is just outplaying them in a lot of different areas. This game was significantly closer than game number 1. Game 1 was a mess in a lot of different ways for HLE. Peanut ended up running it down. Viper had a pretty terrible game. That was not the case here in game number 2. Peanut actually played really well here on the Xin Zhao, one of the stronger champions in the game at the moment. Zeka, Viper, they had gold, they had resources, but the problem was that T1 was just a little bit better in terms of their execution, and the diff, instead of being in the jungle this time, ended up being on the top side of the map, which is insane. Again, not particularly unexpected considering these two's, I guess, history playing off against each other in these big best of 5s domestically, but certainly an interesting turn of events nonetheless. So let's go ahead and get into it. Of course, talking about draft, once again, I'm really not in love with the combinations coming out on either side here. I think both teams leave a lot to be desired, but at least the direction is pretty clear now. Instead of HLE wanting to control the mid game, this time it's T1 who want to control the mid game, utilizing the macro duo of Pantheon and Ryze, the global ultimate duo of the Grand Starfall, of course, alongside the Realm Warp coming in from both of those champions. And you know what? They did exactly that. They certainly did a better job of that than Hanwha Life did in the previous game, where they were utilizing specifically the Ryze to move basically everywhere around the map. It helped that Keria was awesome this game on the Poppy, being able to move around to exactly where they wanted the play to happen. Keria was doing a great job basically initiating every play that they wanted to go for and then calling Ryze or calling Pantheon or calling both of them to be able to assist him with the plays. It was really great stuff. Keria's Poppy was insane. Typically in best of 5s against Hanwha Life, you either have to ban Poppy out regularly or you have to take it early on in a lot of these drafts in order to take it off the board for Peanut, because he is really that good. He was kind of the originator of Poppy Jungle in terms of just what he was capable of doing, but Keria gets it on R4 and almost takes over the entire game. The only reason Keria is not getting player of the game in this one is because of Doran on the top side, which again we'll get into. Let's quickly finish up talking about the Hanwha Life draft as well. Once again, it just feels like there's some conflicting ideas here. I get the overall power of some of these picks, and I get the individual ideas, right? Like, okay, Victor is kind of considered the counter to Ryze. Victor's very good into Ryze because of his ability to team fight super consistently. Ryze's macro difference isn't quite as impactful. His ability to split push isn't quite as strong when Victor can 1v9 be a primary carry option in terms of damage in a lot of these fights. And so in isolation, I get that. Xin Zhao's one of the strongest champions in the meta right now. In isolation, I'm never going to criticize a team for picking Xin Zhao early on in a draft. Even something like Jin being able to be a little bit more weak side, but also still having pressure in the mid to late game, it adds a lot. Sion being able to stay stable on the top side. All of these picks I feel generally fine about. The problem is, I don't think any of them really work together in the way that maybe you would want. Xin Zhao wants to skirmish a ton early and often, and Victor, Jin, Sion, they don't really want to match those skirmishes. It's going to be really difficult for the Xin Zhao to actually do what he wants to do in this game. Peanut still was very good and was very active, but it just didn't end up being quite enough. And for Zeka's case, like, you're playing Victor, you want to play for these 5v5 team fights. Well, you don't really have a ton of ways to, like, stay safe in these fights. And generally speaking, if the Mbessa or, you know, even just like a Pantheon or a Ryze gets onto the backline, there's like one big play, like you die, it's kind of over. Jin's going to be able to offer stability, but so is Sion on the top side. So are you playing weak side for both bot lane and top lane? Like, it's a comp that in isolation works, like the champions work. I just don't really like the idea of putting them together, not nearly as much as I like the idea of T1 just drafting Pantheon Ryze, getting the most flexible AD carry in the game in Varus, and then, you know, picking up things like Poppy and Mbessa to round things out that obviously ended up working for them. So T1 definitely taking advantage of that, and Doran really the one kind of pushing that forward. He's player of the game, and it's not particularly close. You know, a lot of jokes going around right now. This series taking place on Father's Day, and Doran once again beating up on Zeus in a best of 5. We've gotten pretty accustomed to these two actually playing this way in these major domestic tournaments at the very least. I know Doran gets shit on a lot, but I've been a big Doran defender over the course of his career because he's awesome domestically in these playoffs. Like, in these big moments, he always steps up in these situations, and he did so once again, not only in lane on the Mbessa, where he was able to get a very big lead, as is expected in a matchup like this. Mbessa has a ton of combat power early, which people very much underrate very regularly, but also, of course, can take over in team fights if you are able to land the public executions. But even on top of that, right, like the late game impact of just being able to say, hey, Zeka, like, you want to stand there and fight, like, you want to be the Victor that gets peeled for and be the primary carry option in these 5v5s. What if I just killed you? Like, what if I just 1v1'd you out of this entire fight with Viper hitting me and doing no damage throughout the entire thing? Doran's ability to get ahead, and then his ability to completely break open the backline of HLE completely dismantled their game plan, and that's what ended up being the biggest difference. So credit to Doran. Again, I think Faker had a really good game on the Ryze, but Keria was also the one that needed to be considered for player of the game. If Doran didn't get it, it should go to Keria on the Poppy. And then for HLE on the other side, like, again, it's just frustrating. It's frustrating to look at a team that should be in a better spot and say, like, well, you got good champions, but what did you really get out of it as a team composition? Like, where exactly do you play this comp? Where do you spike? What do you do at a really high level? I can't really answer that. And that on top of the fact that Zeus ends up continuously getting outplayed, that's a problem. He's the MVP guy on HLE. He's the one that really needed to step up and be kind of the main centralizing force for the team, because as much as Doran steps up in the playoffs, you would consider Doran the weak link of T1, and you would consider Zeus the strength of Hanwha Life. To see it go the other way in this series is kind of a disaster overall for HLE, and Zeus was just useless on this Sion. Not only was he super far behind in lane, that's to be expected, but Mbessa was way more useful in these fights. What's Sion going to be peeling in this game? Absolutely nothing, and so it just ends up being a massive issue. Peanut was good, but ends up getting hard countered by Poppy as the game continues to go along. Again, Zeka and Viper can't really ever play from the backline. What's Delight going to do? Again, an engage tank on a player that can't really play around losing lanes. Like, it's kind of a disaster. There's nothing really to play off of here, and it ended up really costing Hanwha Life. But now they're down 0-2. They're going into this third game, and they have to win it to even stay alive. They've seen what a reverse sweep can look like. Now it's time for them to try and put it into action, but that's going to start with game 3, and you can't be looking past that. You can't be thinking about games 4 and 5. It's now or never for Hanwha Life. And for T1 on the other side, if they can win this series, not just convincingly, but in a sweep against Hanwha Life, that's ginormous. Again, this team, this organization would not hear the end of it if they missed 2 straight international tournaments, and so this is a big one for them as well. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1, they are going to take this game. They are going to win this series 3-0, and they will be your final team that qualifies for the mid-season invitational here in 2025 as a representative from the LCK. Somehow, someway, this series was not close. This was the least close of the 3 games, although game 1 certainly, gave this one a run for its money, I'll just say. What a weird series. HLE ends up really shitting the bed here today. Something happened after game number 2 of that series against Gen G, where all of their confidence just flew out the window. Their momentum was just gone. I can't even begin to describe it. The last 5 games that HLE played, they were a completely different team, and I just can't really say why. This is a team and a group of players that normally does step up in these big moments. They're kind of known for being clutch, game 5 merchants, if you want to call them that, but not over the last, recent memory. They were really bad at the end of this playoff run, and I assume it's just them probably needing some time off. They have not really had any across all of this year. You have to remember, they started in winter, they immediately went to first stand, and then immediately after first stand, the spring split started, and then they immediately went into this road to MSI. They didn't get any warm-up series. They had to immediately play Gen G and T1, and they're the only 2 teams that they played in the playoffs. It's just a weird schedule. Maybe some time off is actually going to do this team good, but T1 is relishing in the opportunity to be able to take advantage of a weakened Hanwha Life esports and make their way to an international tournament so early on in the year. I didn't think they were going to be able to get this done. I'm stunned by this outcome. This is one of the more shocking, best of 5 outcomes throughout all of this year. Not the most, because WE beating top esports will not be topped really anywhere across the world, but this is certainly one that I did not see coming really under any circumstance. But let's talk about what actually happened. Again, first off, let's talk about the drafts. One of the simpler conversations to have about draft in this series, because I think for the first time, both teams actually indexed into doing something. For Hanwha Life, they're indexing into early game. It's Peanut on his Nidalee. At first, we thought this was going top lane. Eventually, it ends up moving to Peanut in the jungle. He's played a ton of this and had a ton of success over the course of this year in particular. And, we wanted to see them play through the early game. You've got Galio to be able to kind of shut down what Annie wants to do at level 6, so long as he does end up playing it right and holding taunt for the right moment. You've got Lucian to be able to play off of. Lucian Braum has picked up a ton of priority as just this, early game powerhouse lane. You typically wanted Milio or, Nami, obviously, with the Lucian to try to make him more relevant in the mid and late game, but Braum is indexing entirely into, well, our level 3 is the strongest in the entire game. Let's go ahead and fight for that. And then you've got Gnar on the top side, which obviously is fine, generally speaking, but really the identity of this comp revolves around the Nidalee and her ability to play early and win a lot of these early game fights, because you're looking at good matchups top lane and you're looking at a good matchup mid lane, because Galio can, again, kind of shut down what Annie wants to do depending on the circumstance. But T1 have the scaling advantage in this game. You've got the Xayah as the bailout. You've got Cassante on the top side of the map, who is a gigantic teamfight threat in the back half of the game. You typically don't feel that with a Lee Sin comp, but I absolutely believe that this team will get better as the game continues to go along. And so if they generate big early leads, and specifically if Owner can just outplay Peanut, spoiler alert, that's exactly what happens. This series is going to get out of control really, really fast. This game's going to get out of control really fast, because if Lee Sin is winning in the early game and T1 scales better, it's just doomed for Hanwha Life. You don't really have a lot of outs in that instance. I think that there is a circumstance where Lee Sin feels kind of useless in a game like this, if worst case scenario ends up happening. Just for those of you at home that are maybe thinking, well, why don't all teams just draft a big scaling comp with a really aggressive jungler that can, halt any sort of aggression coming in on the other side? A big reason why is because if Lee Sin can't win in the jungle, if he's not just straight up better than Peanut without really a lot of support here to be able to make that easy, then he's probably in a position where you're playing a 4v5, which is really not ideal when Owner's one of your best players. But again, if you trust him to go out there and win no matter what the setup looks like, then yeah, you can go ahead and do that, and Owner was excellent. But player of the game for me in game 3, it's going to go to Keria on the Rakan. We'll talk about it. He's not player of the series. Player of the series is exactly who you think it's going to be, but his Rakan was absolutely unreal. His Poppy in game 2 was gorgeous. His Rakan in game 3 was gorgeous. He just outclassed basically everybody on HLE throughout this entire series. It really was a bit of a masterclass on how to play, and Keria has not really shown us this side of him so far in 2025. He's not had these dominant games where he's able to just unlock his playmaking ability, and so to see that in this series is really nice. I think some people are going to run with this narrative a bit too much. I think Keria has been inconsistent this year to say the absolute most, but I think the best version of him is still the best support in the world. Like, he's always been that. There have been moments throughout the last couple of years where he's always been the best support in the world. I don't know if we've gotten that for extended periods of time, but again, to know that that is still there is obviously really nice. But player of the series, come on, man. You know exactly who it is. It's Doran in the top lane. Nobody really had to think about this. Doran was unbelievable in this series. He dumpstered Zeus in game 2, and he dumpstered him once again here in game number 3. Again, we will get into that. I just wanted to give Keria a little bit of a shout out for game number 3 here, but if you wanted to give Doran player of the game on this Cassante, I think that's entirely fine. This was not a close top lane matchup. Doran did the absolute most into Zeus, and it was really crazy to watch. I know that this is how this matchup has gone historically, but specifically this year, with the way that these teams are constructed, I am surprised to see Doran have so much success in the playoffs, and I'm certainly welcoming it. This guy is like the domestic playoff king, and now he's going to get the chance to back that up and kind of follow that through at MSI. I hope he really comes through internationally for once, because that's really the only thing stopping this guy from being considered one of the best top laners of all time. Like, genuinely, that's the kind of conversation he's in at this point. Owner mega gapped Peanut throughout this entire series. The Jungle Canyon in this series was absolutely huge, and we talked about that. Again, Peanut was the one player that had kind of been a liability for Hanwha Life throughout the regular season. To see him also really struggle in a series like this, not ideal. Faker was awesome, had a great game number 1. I think that was the game that stood out the most, but still very good in this series. Gumayusi was awesome in game 3. You know, I talked about Keria and Doran and Owner being really good. Gumayusi might have been the best player in this game. He had an argument. He was in the conversation for being player of the game here for just how well he played the Xayah as kind of the quote-unquote bailout threat that they didn't really need to get bailed out because, you know, he was really good in the early game anyways. And so it's just a team effort from T1. It's everybody playing at such a high level, and it's everyone doing their jobs and doing them well. This team has more than earned their spot internationally, and I'm excited to see what they can do there. And then for Hanwha Life, you've got to feel incredibly disappointed by this outcome. I'm pretty sure this team was already kind of packing their bags for Canada before this series even started, and so for them to get swept, maybe they were just overlooking things, or maybe they're just tired, and maybe they're out of, you know, form right now. Like, I think that that's totally possible, because they were in form at the beginning of that Gen G series, and then something in their brains just unclicked. Like, the switch got unflipped, and all of a sudden they shut back off, specifically Zeka there, but in this series, it was Zeus. I mean, there's nothing else left to say. Zeus got dumpstered by Doran once again. He's dud of the game. Again, I don't give dud of the series, but just like I talked about with Zeka in that series against Gen G, it would go to Zeus. Like, he got massacred across these games, specifically games 2 and 3, where he just was not particularly close in any meaningful way. This Gnar was useless, and he was the MVP contender and candidate from this HLE team for him to be the one that underperforms so much when they have their backs up against the wall against his former team. It's just, it's really crazy. It's disappointing, if anything, right? Like, you wanted to see Zeus come out and prove that he made the right decision, like he did in the winter split when he did help this team win a best of 5 against T1, but he could not back that up once again here, and he really let the team down. Peanut is the other member who just was horrendous in this series, and honestly, I'm concerned about Peanut because it's been a pretty prolonged period of time where he's not been all that great throughout this year. I think things will get on the right track because his track record is just simply too good for him to play like this regularly, but I'm serious. Like, I've watched Peanut throughout his entire career in every region, in the LCK, in the LPL, like wherever he's been, he's never played quite like he's been over the past, like, specifically 6 weeks. It might be the worst stretch of his entire career. I know SKT fans might, you know, jump against that, but he was better on SKT than he certainly has been over the past couple of weeks. It really has not looked good for Peanut, and he's a big reason why they're missing out internationally. Zeka was not useful really at all in this series. I'm not blaming him. He was probably the best player on the team, but that's really saying nothing because the rest of this team was a disaster. Viper was horrible. I mean, he was completely useless. No damage, no positioning, no nothing. People continuously try to tell me that Viper right now is better than Ruler. I don't know how you can make that argument, man. Like, not only did the previous series kind of prove that, because Ruler was better in the back half, and that's why they ended up going to MSI, but Viper shit the bed once again here, this time against Gumayusi. Like, it just is what it is. Keria was better than Viper and Delight, and, you know, we've been calling them the best bot lane in the LCK. That is certainly up for debate after series like this, because they kind of got exposed. There's nothing else left to say. So for HLE, some reflection is necessary for them to go back to the well and try to figure out what they need to do moving forward. Luckily, for the first time in 2025, they're actually going to have some time off in order to go and do that. But for T1 on the other side, congratulations once again to this team. Congratulations on being able to qualify for an international tournament. I know that that was a big deal for the organization. That's why they put Gumayusi back in the first place, is because they needed to be top 2, and they end up getting the job done. This team does feel like they're kind of peaking right now after a bad end to the regular season. Go figure. That's kind of how everything ends up going here in the LCK, but it's really cool to see T1, you know, continue their run of dominance. You can't stop this team from figuring it out when it matters. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Round 4 overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for my spring split coverage here on Super Cam and Rocks, like on the YouTube channel in the entirety of LoL Esports. We are done with the spring split. It's MSI time. That is the next thing on the docket. Up on the screen, you can see T1, the final team to officially qualify for MSI. We have our teams locked and loaded, our 10 teams ready to go, and I, for one, could not be more excited about where this tournament is going to be heading. I really do think there are a lot of interesting storylines to talk about, and I certainly don't think my opinions on these players are consensus at the current moment. I think that there's going to be a lot of dispute when my player rankings or team rankings end up coming out later on next week. So if you're excited for that, stick around on the channel, hit subscribe. We're going to be posting MSI coverage every single day of the tournament. We'll do pre-tournament coverage, like I said, power rankings, primers, all of that stuff that you're used to on this channel, a meta report that we do before every international tournament. But we're also going to be covering every single day of action, every day. Like, genuinely, we're going to be posting a video, after every single day of action. So stick around on this channel if you want that. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. If you enjoyed this video, though, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. But with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all